Hello and welcome. I am very pleased to introduce today in this People and Purpose interview Lady Kitty Chisholm and Shaheena Janjuha-Jivraj of Boardwalk Leadership. And you're both the authors of a book called Championing Women Leaders, and this will be the topic of our conversation today. But before we go into that, would you mind just introducing yourselves briefly and saying a few words about who you are and your own journey to championing women leaders?
Good morning, Esther. It's lovely to be with you today. My name is Shaheena Janjuha-Jivraj. I am co-founding director of Boardwalk Leadership. And my history is I've come from a family business background, spent a lot of time in academia, did a PhD on family business leadership, and was always drawn into looking at the role of women in family businesses and then subsequently within entrepreneurial ventures. And whether or not women had a very strong voice, I always ended up having a particular focus on them. And having taught entrepreneurship for about 15 years, I then decided that I had enough of teaching. I wanted to start doing a lot more doing. And 5 years ago, we set up Boardwalk Leadership, which has a very, very strong focus around leadership development for women and helping organizations to be more inclusive in their diversity policies and really get the financial benefits and the business benefits from being truly inclusive.
I'm Kitty Chisholm. My career has been quite a long and varied one. I think I'm kind of on my 9th or 10th career now. I came to an aha moment kind of somewhere in my late 30s, early 40s, when I looked around me and I saw so many able, really talented young women not making it, and seeing men who, some of whom were less able, going further and faster. And I started thinking then about what that was and what it was all about and not liking it really. So when I came to retire, I became a coach and I got into neuroscience and behavior change and was passionate about using that to help women advance in their careers. And so when Shaheena and I have known each other for a long time and got together, we said, what can we do together that we can't do on our own, that's going to create a real leap to advance leadership? Our first client wanted not just a leadership program for women, but wanted to extend it to men as well. And we found that all the principles that we were applying from our own experience and knowledge, entrepreneurship, how people learn, how people change, applied equally well to both. And we were able to leverage that for the company as a whole. And we were absolutely thrilled to see the results. We had more than 50% of the women on the program promoted. We had the first woman global director in a global director position for that company, which happened to be an American tech multinational. It was just fantastic. So that gave us a huge boost and a thrill. And that's really what we've been doing ever since. And writing books.
Of course. So you're clearly both passionate about this topic of enabling women to really be at their very best and to thrive in their roles. And there's lots of organizational benefits to that. All the research suggests that there are significant benefits to organizations being more inclusive and really enabling everyone, regardless of gender and all sorts of other factors, to succeed, to bring their best. So what do you see as some of the key opportunities in being a more diverse, more inclusive organization?
Well, there's a lot there. There's a lot of research that's been done to try to understand what that benefit looks like, because we can talk about it in broad terms. There's some work that was done last year which showed that companies that are gender diverse have a 15% uplift on their financial performance. This was a piece of work that was carried out during the financial crisis across sector and across Europe. So the measurements are quite robust, and those findings are really significant. The other piece to this as well is if you think about the way businesses operate and the recruitment processes, you will have 50-50 male-female recruitment at graduate level. Invariably, you'll actually have the girls who are likely to be earning more than their male counterparts at that point. But 10 years down the line, a number of those women have dropped off, and we call it's just like falling off a cliff edge. And, people often talk about this is where women start to hit the glass ceiling. But in essence, you just see large numbers of women leaving the company. And that attrition is huge. And it actually starts to keep gaining momentum until we get to senior or executive level. If you think about the costs of attrition, they're absolutely huge. So 10 years on, middle management, losing somebody costs a company around 120 to 150% of their salary. That's huge. So when you talk about the financial performance, there are two aspects. There's the money the company saves by keeping its talent that it's worked so hard to attract in the first place. But the second piece is if you are really, really, truly successful at being inclusive, and that's why for us, the inclusivity piece is even more important than the diversity piece. Because it's one thing to have diverse teams. It's another thing to enable those teams to work, think, behave, and make decisions in an inclusive way. And that's where you then start to see the benefits in terms of innovation. You get to see better benefits in terms of taking those ideas to market, to commercializing them. That's where you see the uplift on financial performance. There is also a huge amount in terms of creating better working places. And the geek in me always likes to do research around this area. And one of our very first pieces of research in 2011 was asking 500 women from across a range of sectors what the barriers were that they felt were holding them back from leadership roles. Mm-hmm. And they talked about the fact that they needed to step up. And we'll talk about a bit more about that when we talk about the championing piece. But they were very clear that they didn't like what they saw at the top of the organization. And if they didn't like what they saw at the top, they weren't willing to stick around for it. Right. So there is a really big piece about creating a workplace and an organizational culture that does its absolute best to hold on to that talent.
And presumably, while women may be more likely to not stick around in that environment, changing that environment for the better benefits everybody else as well. So it benefits even the groups of staff who don't go through that attrition because they're not as sensitive maybe to how they view the organization. But it doesn't mean that they wouldn't benefit from those improvements.
Absolutely. And I think we found we work with a lot of companies who want to create that change within their organization, to question some of the assumptions around workplace practices, to question the assumptions about how they take their time off. And we have as many men as women talking to us about how they flex their bonuses around compared to taking extra time off to spend more time with their children during school breaks and holidays. So the beauty with this whole area at the moment is it's not just about benefiting women, and it's not about pitting the women against the men. It's actually about giving the men a chance to say, do you know what? This is going to be better, more beneficial for my family, or even for individuals who don't have children, for them to say, actually, if I can have some flex or have the opportunity to do something in my life that really inspires and motivates me, I don't have to leave my work to do this, but I get the flex and I can bring those new skills back into the workplace.
Which is, again, a perfect example of the win-win, isn't it? That it's good for the organization in terms of engagement, but not just engagement. It's good for the organization because, as you say, people bring back those experiences, those skills, the resilience they might build, etc. And, of course, it's good for the individuals. Nice. So how would you define championing women leaders?
Well, we define championing as advocating talented women throughout an organization or even across organizations. And what that means is being able not just to identify the talent, but to identify the opportunities where putting a really talented individual, men and women, will benefit both that individual and the organization. And we've seen examples of that, both within organizations, small and large, and across organizations. And you might not think that somebody can champion you when they're in a completely different field, but we've seen that work, and it's so creative. What that might look like in practice is you get a young woman coming into an organization, and her first boss spots the fact that she's got something exceptional, some real talent, some high potential. And that person becomes a champion. So for example, they can spot a project, which is quite a difficult project, and say, I think this person would be great on that project. Not necessarily the project lead at the early stages, but to work on that project. What that does is it gives the young talented person a chance to shine with a bit of backing and support. It gives them stretch that they wouldn't automatically get. And it also gives them confidence. Because if you do something that stretches you and succeed, it builds your confidence. So it's like a triple whammy. The company benefits, quadruple whammy. The company benefits, the individual benefits. And the best bit of all is if you get that kind of championing, 20 years later, your CV, after you've been away and had the kids and come back and lost your confidence and done all of that, your CV and the CV of one of the men who's around you and the same sort of age isn't that different. If you don't get those stretch opportunities that take you out of the ordinary, when you do come back after maternity leave, there's a gap. And that gap means that when you're looking at who to promote next, it's very hard to take a fair judgment and say, yes, I know she's just as talented, maybe she even has higher potential, but look at her track record. So that's a huge piece. And then going back to the idea of championing across organization, say that early boss moves and goes right to the top of another organization, say, in banking, we've seen that happen. And they've got influence, not just in their own organization, but across the sector. And when it comes to a gap on a non-exec, for a non-exec position or even an executive position, they go back and they pick up the phone and they say, how are you doing? What are you doing? Have you looked at this? You haven't? Just because you've got a toddler? Come on, you can do this. I'll have a word. And what that 2011 survey told us is that women knew that men got that for what they did.
Yeah.
So part of championing is redressing that balance.
And we've got so many examples in the book that we pulled out. We interviewed about 60 women leaders across 53 countries as part of our preparation for the book. And we pulled out 20 cases that we've included in the book. And they're very, very different cases. So there are some fantastic examples of championing from the political sector, where one woman her champion was actually the Prime Minister. And he was helping to spot opportunities. And even when she took on quite strong and quite controversial advocacy roles around women's rights, he was constantly there supporting and putting his name to it. But also fantastic examples of women benefiting from championship in the corporate sector and also within social enterprises. So great examples both within organizations and, as Kitty said, across organizations.
And in pretty much every sector of life, of course, because the same principles must apply.
Yeah, every sector you can think of.
Absolutely.
Tech, charities, entrepreneurial startups, you name it.
Pharmaceutical, health,
insurance.
Banking. Yeah. I mean, and I think this is why we're really excited about this, because we were asked to do a big piece of work by the Commonwealth Secretariat, benchmarking the number of women in leadership roles across the private, public, and political sector. And when we went in and collected that data, we could see that many countries consistently did not have the data on women in leadership. But more importantly, there wasn't the visibility of women in leadership roles. So we went in to add to the quantitative data and collecting these case studies. And the thing that had been niggling us was a lot of the research that talked about, or the work that was coming out and the interventions supporting women, for example, through sponsorship, they were embedded in a very North American, Western European context. And we wanted to see what model would hold up globally. So whether you have a woman in Malaysia or South Africa, whether you have somebody in Bangladesh or Peru, what mechanisms would help any of these women move into leadership roles? Because what we did find out was the ambition, the motivation is there regardless. It doesn't matter about the cultural context, but then the mechanisms, you almost need a global set of mechanisms that can work. So you don't have companies or individuals saying, well, it's okay for somebody in the UK. The context allows for this, but in India it won't happen because the legal or the social framework is different. And as we went and did this research and combined that with all the work we were doing with companies, it was brilliant because we were developing our thinking, then taking it back into the companies, evolving our application further back and forth. So very much action research.
Yeah. Can you just define the difference between sponsorship and championing? Because I think sponsorship is something that's probably quite familiar to a number of people who've thought about this before. But it may not be immediately obvious the difference between championship and sponsorship.
What we found is that sponsorship tends to be a bit transactional.
Right.
In other words, I'll promote you, but when I promote you, you've got to be loyal to me and you've got to work very hard on my agenda. I will get quite a lot out of promoting you. Whereas with champions, what we found, it was for the sheer delight in seeing somebody talented progress. We also interviewed some champions, and one was a male, and he was quite senior, and again, a tech US multinational. And I asked him the question, and I said, okay, John, what was in it for you? Because we had 3 or 4 women in that organization saying, oh, you must talk to John. He was a brilliant champion. He helped me. He supported me. He made sure that I got the opportunity to interview for this. And so I said, what was in it for you? And he looked completely blank. That question had never occurred to him. And what his answer was, well, I saw all these really talented women, and they didn't know they were talented. They didn't know. They didn't realize their potential. They didn't know where to take it. And I saw that they needed some kind of boost or even push to their confidence. And I could do that. And that really triggered it for us. The difference for us between sponsorship and championing is one is transactional, and one is a genuine belief in spotting talent and promoting it for the good of the organization with some care for the individual as well.
And what's interesting is that is just a core positive leadership trait, isn't it? It's actually something that you would ideally like leaders to do for all of their people, regardless of any other issues or agendas. It's just the behavior that you would like to see across organizations all over the place.
Absolutely, and I think we're very clear. What we're talking about, it's not rocket science, but actually by identifying these distinct traits, pulling them out, and being able to say that they are global, they're applicable, and labeling them, it allows people to really step back and question whether or not they do it. And more often than not, we find people do want to share their examples and stories of either being championed or championing someone. So it certainly creates a positive approach to for people to identify how they've pulled that talent through. And, that transactional piece was a really, really big sticking piece for us because, again, you think about the countries I've talked about, going into some of those countries and looking at creating a sponsorship relationship, which is very, very heavily transactional, would be a non-starter for many of these women.
Right.
And the undertones with around it could also be quite difficult. So we really needed to find something that was very, very clear around what can you do as an individual to find the best possible talent, nurture it and retain it for the benefit of your company, even your own career at the end of the day, because you're all working towards the same goal of working with the best possible people.
Yeah. Excellent. So the framework that you've come up with around this is the CHAMP framework. So can you talk us through the aspects of that framework, please, or the steps?
Absolutely. And again, it's very, very steeped in a lot of the research and application evidence that we've developed over the last 5 years. In 2011, when people talked about gender diversity in companies, the assumption was that it was all the problem lay with the women. So if you fix the women, everything would get solved. They would step up, they would stay in their roles, they might have babies, they may not, but let's fix the women and everything's fine. And of course, that's not the case. And it wasn't really addressing what the bigger issues were. As we moved on, we recognized that actually there are two sides to this. There is certainly something about women needing to step up, and women themselves recognize that they don't always identify the best resources for their own career development. Some of this comes down to their own levels of competence. But there's also a huge piece about the culture of the organization and how it presents itself, whether it's an appealing option for women to invest their careers in for the next 20, 30, 40 years, whether they have faith that they'll actually, whether there's enough trust and a track record there that they will get promoted. And so for us, the CHAMP framework became something where we moved from looking at what the organization was doing to what happens with the individual. And the cultural which makes up the C, it's very much about the organizational culture and dealing with creating more transparency and a more inclusive place. The H stands for hesitancy. And again, we know time and again, women will push back. There are issues around confidence. There are distinct differences between the way men see their career and their abilities compared to women. And it's recognizing that, because you can't always assume that a woman's going to walk up to a senior leader and say, will you champion me? Will you advocate for me? More often than not, they expect to be noticed. But actually building that hesitancy into the model allows for champions to recognize just because somebody says no for a stretch opportunity, it's not no because they're not ambitious enough to do it. It's no because the confidence is holding them back. And then the champion thinks about how they can go back in, nurture. This is where the nurturing really comes in, and helping them think about what this opportunity means for them and the importance for the organization. The A is for advocacy. This again comes back to what I've just talked about. One of the things we found, as we've worked with women through research and also through all the training programs and the leadership development we've engaged with them, their motivation is so strong. It's really high. And I think back to my earlier point where there was an assumption that women needed to be fixed. Part of that assumption was women weren't motivated enough. They weren't willing to put themselves forward and deal with hard work and get to these leadership roles. But actually the behavioral differences are so significant, and women, the way in which they'll manifest their motivation is quite different to their male counterparts. So a really big piece about the CHAMP model is for women to recognize they are motivated and how they take responsibility for that, but also for the champions to also help nurture that. And all of this culminates in the P, which is power. And really for us, the bottom line is it's the impact of having diverse leadership and inclusivity within an organization.
Mm. And what's interesting about the power bit then is that actually that's almost what would be necessary for this traditional sponsorship to be feasible. But because of how the CHAMP model builds up, it makes it very clear that actually you don't have the power with which to trade until sort of the end of that model.
Absolutely. But the only thing that's very important within championing, your champion has to be a person of significant influence and credibility, so they can leverage on their reputation, they can leverage on their relationships to bring their talent into those stretch roles.
Yeah. The power thing is also about the special qualities that women bring. I mean, we all know that men and women are actually more alike than they are different in most aspects to do with the brain. But there are ways in which women leaders operate on the whole different. And for me, one of the best examples of that was Steve Shirley, who was a very early pioneer and set up the all-women software company in the 60s that became F International. And she says, always remember that leadership is nothing unless the people led give of their best. And she finishes up by saying is leadership, like love, is more about giving than taking. And for me, that encapsulates the power of women leaders. They tend to be more motivated by lifting others up. They tend to be more motivated by not by their own success, but by their impact on their community and their society, by the bigger picture. And if you get someone at the top of the organization who is genuinely genuinely motivated by that bigger cause, and again, I'd say not all women, I'm not talking about men not doing this, but women have a particular tendency for this, then you are lifting the whole organization. And that, for me, is the encapsulation of the power of women leaders.
And that's a perfect summary, and also explains so many of the organizational benefits that we started with. So why is it that the CHAMP framework in particular then works to enable women to step into leadership? What is it about it that makes that difference?
Going back to what Shaheena said about it not being about fixing women, the one thing that women themselves told us, both in the interviews and our surveys, is we recognize we need to be more assertive. Right. And when you unpick that, it's about the difference in confidence levels between men and women. And that is possibly as a result of the greater amount of testosterone, because confidence and testosterone are correlated. Right. And we all know, anecdotally, that men tend to put themselves forward for a new job if they meet 50% of the criteria, and women don't unless they meet well over 70%. Now, that anecdote is actually more or less true. There is a lot of evidence to say that is the case. There's also a lot of evidence to say that women, on the whole, are less confident than men. And why championship really works for women is because having someone outside believe in you, believe in your talent, support, advocate, builds your confidence. Just the fact that it's an outside one, and a respected outside. Two, that by putting you into those stretch opportunities and giving you a chance to succeed, every success, every win builds your confidence. If you get that early on, it's a confidence boost. Whereas the sponsorship relationship, you do something for me, I'll do something for you, is less confidence building. It's not that they believe in you. They believe in what you can do to help them.
Which is a significant difference, isn't it?
And it is a significant difference. So we think championing works both for men and women. It certainly works for other minorities. I would say other minorities, women are majority, but for minorities in organization, where particularly ethnic minorities might struggle in some cultures. It works for both, but it works particularly well for women because it addresses that confidence back.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So if you were to put forward maybe a single suggestion for either women who are hoping to step up into leadership, who see that potential and the opportunity in themselves, or in fact organizations who want to do better, beyond obviously reading your book and engaging with the CHAMP model, is there anything in particular that you would suggest they go and do as the first step?
I think I would say the big piece would be for women to think about why they want those leadership roles. That's a really big piece. Ensure that their brand is strong and they've got a good network and they're exposed to a good network. So actually it's easier for the champions to spot them. They can't assume they'll be spotted. They've also got to put quite a bit of work into this.
And I would say that for organizations, creating not just policies, but a culture that supports championing, that talks to line managers about the power they have to identify and advocate for talented individuals, men and women, and explain how that works particularly well for women, and give them some training in how to have that conversation. Because particularly some line managers who've been in the role for 30 years, they're not used to it. They're not used to what they expect. They're not used to someone who says, when they're told, I think you're really good, you ought to go for this job. No, who me? It was the team who did it. That's a female. The man would say, thank you. And so getting them to understand the differences at a very basic level and also to understand unconscious bias. And create that culture where championing is welcomed and supported and very open. So it's not seen as another version of the old corner. That, for me, is what I would recommend to organizations.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you for building out the framework, because I think it's an excellent way for organizations to just see more of a step-by-step process ahead of them. Excellent. Thank you. Great. Okay. So is there anything else that you wanted to share in particular, anything that was sort of missed out
on? I think my only point would be not to forget the power of unconscious bias.
Yeah.
We all have it.
Yeah.
Every human being has it. It's not a sin. It's not wickedness. It's just the way the brain works. And it's a shortcut the brain takes. The worst thing about unconscious bias is not what we have about other people, the ones that aren't like us. It's the ones we assimilate from our environment about ourselves. It is the unconscious bias that girls acquire at school when they say girls aren't good at maths. And so being aware of that is very, very important, because it plays so much into the championing story.
And it does that on both sides, because you're right, you highlight the women's own unconscious bias, the stories they tell about themselves. But of course, it also plays into how the organization sees its female staff or its BME staff or whatever, or how it selects people and with that.
I mean, an absolute classic encapsulation of that is, how often have you heard a woman say when she's praised for an achievement, I was lucky. It was the team. It wasn't me. Owning your achievements, owning the responsibility for your career is hugely important. And that's something that championing genuinely helps you do.